Somewhere in the last 7 days, one of the loudest men in hip-hop history got handed a number so small that people genuinely thought it was a typo. Not a slow week. Not a soft debut. A number that looked like a misprint on a chart nobody expected him to be scraping the bottom of. And by the time you finish this video, you are going to understand exactly how a man who spent 3 straight months telling the entire planet he had just made a classic ended up with an opening week that his own fans are struggling to defend out loud. And before I break down a single digit of this, do me one favor and hit that like button. Actually hit it. Hammer it. Because what we are about to walk through is the kind of story that the loyalty accounts are going to spend the next week trying to bury, and every like on this video makes it harder for them to pretend it never happened. Tap it, and if you have not already, get subscribed, because there is a second half to this story that almost nobody online is talking about yet, and I promise you it is the part that actually matters. So here is the confirmation. 2,000 human beings, out of a planet of 8 billion, reportedly decided to purchase an album from a man who told us on camera, repeatedly, with a straight face, that he was already paid before the album ever came out. And I want to be extremely clear about something before the comment section explodes, because it is going to. Rick Ross is not a failed artist. Rick Ross is not broke. Rick Ross is not somebody you get to laugh at from your bedroom while you owe your landlord money. The man has a catalog, a company, a legacy, and a car collection with its own zip code. That is not what this is about. This is about what happens when the mouth writes a check that the machine cannot cash. And nobody in modern rap wrote a bigger check this year than Rick Ross did. For nearly 3 months before this album arrived, Rick Ross ran what might genuinely be the most aggressive interview siege I have ever watched a veteran artist run. Not a couple of appearances. Not a radio run and a magazine cover. A relentless, back-to-back, week-after-week campaign across every podcast with a microphone and a ring light. And to his credit, and I mean that sincerely, he did not do the thing that most artists at his level do, which is show up, dodge everything remotely spicy, plug the project, and leave. He did the opposite. He walked into every room and went straight at the hottest topic on the table. He talked about the beef everyone else was tiptoeing around. He talked about the industry politics that make other artists suddenly develop a stutter. He talked about the deals, the money, the ownership, the real estate, the $500 million mindset. And over and over and over again, in interview after interview, he aimed at Drake. Rick Ross did not just release an album into a neutral room. He spent 90 days walking around the room slapping the biggest commercial force in the genre across the face, on camera, for content. And the entire time, the subtext was crystal clear. I am the standard, he is the product, and when my album lands, you will see the difference between a rapper and a brand. He called the project a classic before a single human being had heard it. He said it was the album of the year. He said it was for the real hip-hop listeners, not the people caught up in the propaganda. He told us to go to the product. He reminded us that when other men were doing 1 million first week, he was doing 150,000, and that 20 years later, here we are. And that line, that one specific line, is the one that came back to eat him alive. So let me lay out the trap he built for himself, step by step, because it is honestly a masterclass in how not to roll out a record in 2026. Step 1. He set the expectations ceiling at the absolute maximum. Not, I made something I am proud of. Not, this is my best work in years. He said classic. He said album of the year. That is the highest bar in the entire language of music criticism, and he said it himself, unprompted, months in advance. Step 2. He picked a fight with the one artist whose streaming numbers are the single most quoted statistic in rap. Every time Rick Ross took a shot at Drake's music, he was quietly volunteering to be measured on Drake's scoreboard. Not the critical scoreboard. The commercial one. The one with hard numbers on it that anybody can screenshot. Step 3, and this is the one that actually killed it. He never gave the record a hit. 90 days of conversation, 0 days of a song that grabbed the general public by the collar. No single that took over anything. No moment where a normal person who does not follow rap drama heard a hook and needed to know what it was from. He built an enormous amount of noise around the release, and almost none of it was music. And so the album arrived carrying 3 months of accumulated pressure, a self-issued classic label, an open feud with the most streamed rapper alive, and no hit song underneath any of it. Normally, when a big album lands and people do not like it, the internet splits. You get the loyalists, you get the critics, you get the neutral people saying it is fine, and you get a week of arguing. That is the standard shape of an album backlash. Everybody picks a corner and stays there. That is not what happened with Set in Stone. What happened with Set in Stone is that hip-hop Twitter did something it almost never does, which is agree. The West Coast agreed with the East Coast. The lyric miracle purists agreed with the streaming numbers crowd. The Drake side and the Kendrick side, two camps that have not agreed on the color of the sky in 3 years, put down their weapons, looked at each other, and nodded. One post going around summed it up better than any review did. Every corner of hip-hop Twitter coming together to agree on this album. The specific complaints that came flooding in were remarkably consistent, and I want to go through them properly, because they explain the number better than the number explains itself. The first and loudest complaint was that the project had no center. Listener after listener described it the same way, not as one body of work with a spine and a direction, but as a stack of separate songs with familiar names on them, sitting next to each other with nothing holding them together. Not an album. A folder. And when you have spent 3 months telling the public that this is a cohesive, carved-in-stone statement about 20 years of your life, it plays like a folder is a devastating verdict. The second complaint was about the flows, and this is where it got brutal, because people were not just saying the music was boring. They were saying it sounded borrowed. One widely shared comment claimed the vocal delivery sounded like an impression of the inflections another artist made famous. Somebody else said everybody wants to be a certain Atlanta legend, but not everybody can actually pull it off. Somebody else went further back and said the whole cadence was lifted from a Memphis playbook that predates half the internet. Whether you agree with any of that or not is beside the point. The point is the accusation itself. This is a man who came into the game with one of the most instantly recognizable voices in rap history, and the loudest criticism of his 12th album was that he sounded like somebody else. The third complaint was the packaging. And this is the part that turned criticism into a pile-on, because once people decided the music was not it, they went back and relitigated everything. The cover art got dragged. The visualizers got dragged. The animation in one of the promo clips got dragged so hard that a comment about the way his head moved in it became its own running joke. The rollout got dragged. The lack of a proper single got dragged. And then the jokes started, and the jokes are always where an album actually dies. The replies turned into a comedy competition. People were writing that the whole thing should have been wrapped up before dinner. People were saying he heard about another artist competing for the worst song of the year and wanted in on the race. Somebody described the delivery as an off-the-leash flow. Somebody wrote that even he knows the truth, with the little headshake emoji attached. And the moment that happens, the moment your album becomes a format for jokes instead of a subject for reviews, the conversation is over. You cannot argue with a punchline. You can only wait for it to stop being funny. There was a whole wave of comments that had nothing to do with the songs at all, and everything to do with the fact that Rick Ross has been doing this since 2006. People were not saying, I listened and it did not connect with me. They were saying he is old, he is finished, he should have stopped, the era passed him by. And those are two completely different conversations, and they should not be treated as the same thing. But here is where the story takes the turn that changes everything, and this is the part one need you to stay with me for. Because normally, none of what I just described would matter. I mean that seriously. Bad reviews do not kill big rappers. They never have. There is an entire escape hatch built into modern rap, and every major artist knows exactly where it is. The reviews go badly. The critics pile on, the jokes trend for 4 days, and then the numbers come out and the artist posts the plaque, and suddenly the whole conversation flips. Critics hated it, the fans showed up, the numbers do not lie, keep talking. That move has saved a dozen careers. It has turned dozens of disliked albums into commercial victories that nobody remembers being disliked. That escape hatch requires one thing and one thing only. It is an alarm. Then the first day figures started making the rounds, and the room went quiet. According to the numbers being shared, Set in Stone opened with roughly 1.8 million streams on day 1. Now, if you are not fluent in chart math, that sounds like a big number, because 1.8 million of anything sounds like a big number. So let me translate it into the only language the charts speak. Roughly 1.8 million first day streams converts to somewhere around 1,200 album equivalent units. 1,200. On the biggest day of the album's life. And I need you to understand why day 1 matters more than any other day, because this is the part casual listeners always miss. Release day is the peak. Always. It is the single highest traffic day an album will ever have, and it is not close. That is the night the core fan base stays up until midnight with the app already open. That is the day the playlists reset, the day the press cycle is at maximum volume, the day every algorithm on every platform is actively pushing the record into people's faces for free. Day 1 is the best possible version of your album's performance. So when the peak is around 1,200 units, the math for the rest of the week writes itself. There is no version of that curve that climbs. There is no scenario where day 5 outperforms day 1. Which means the moment those first day figures hit the timeline, everybody who understands charts already knew roughly where this was going to land, days before it officially landed. Now here is your first real question for the comments, and I want an actual answer from you on this one, not a joke. Do you think an album that gets this reception deserves this level of pylon? Or do you think a 20-year veteran with a catalog like his has earned the right to a bad week without the entire internet dancing on it? Tell me. I read these. Because we're about to get into the part where the dancing gets genuinely uncomfortable. Let me talk about the irony, because the irony is the actual story here. Not the number. The number is just evidence. The irony is the crime. Throughout that 90-day press run, Rick Ross was not just promoting an album. He was running a comparison campaign. He was, repeatedly and deliberately, positioning himself against Drake, and specifically against Drake's commercial machinery. The framing was consistent every time. I make music, he makes product. I speak to real listeners, he speaks to an algorithm. I do not need the propaganda, I have the catalog. But there is a rule attached to that argument, and the rule is absolute. If you are going to run the I do not care about numbers defense, you have to actually win the other category. You have to have the reviews. You have to have the critical respect. You have to have the album that people are still defending 3 years later. There are artists who have built entire legacies on exactly that trade, modest commercial performance, dropped into that specific week 48 hours after he had spent 3 months bragging about being paid before the album came out and being the standard the genre should be measured against. It read differently. It read like a man moving the goalposts in real time while the whole stadium watched him carry them. Then Drake's audience showed up. Of course they did. You cannot spend a quarter of a year taking shots at the most defended artist in the genre and expect his people to be gracious. The comparisons started immediately, and they were surgical. One viral post joked that a certain Drake single had done more streams on its 516th day of existence than this album managed in its opening week. Another pointed out that a single recent Drake track had reportedly outperformed the entire Set in Stone tracklist in streams. Whether every one of those specific comparisons holds up under a microscope is honestly beside the point, because virality does not require accuracy. It only requires plausibility. And after 3 months of Rick Ross personally nominating Drake as the benchmark, every single one of those posts was plausible enough to spread. He built the scoreboard. They just read it back to him. And then, right when it could not get more awkward, the man who has been waiting 20 years for this exact week strolled through the door. You already know who I am talking about. Because if there is one person on earth who has been keeping a file on Rick Ross since 2009, opening it every few years, adding to it, and closing it again, it is 50 Cent. This is not a new feud. This is the longest-running, most patient, most professionally executed. He was reacting to videos about the streaming estimates before the official numbers even existed. He was mocking the under 26,000 forecast in real time. And the album he was talking about had reportedly moved north of 400,000 units in its first week. 400,000. If 400,000 is a flop, then the internet has a perfectly reasonable follow-up question about 17,000, and there is no version of that question that has a comfortable answer. That is not a gotcha. That is not media manipulation. That is his own standard, applied to his own release, using his own arithmetic. This is the single most important lesson in this entire situation, and it has nothing to do with Rick Ross specifically. When you publicly install a measurement system to judge another man's work, you have installed it on yourself. Permanently. You cannot uninstall it the week it becomes inconvenient. The audience remembers where you set the line, and they will hold you to the exact height you chose. He set the line at 400,000. And then he walked under it by a distance you could measure with a satellite. So then the question becomes the one everybody is arguing about right now, and it is a legitimately good question. Was any of this actually fair? And I want to handle this honestly, because the easy move here is to just keep piling on. The easy move is to make this the 5th video this week that laughs at a 50-year-old man for having a soft week. But I do not think that is the interesting conversation, and I do not think it is the true one either. So let me make the case for the defense, properly, and I want you to actually consider it. First, and this is not a small thing, 17,000 units in 2026 is not what 17,000 units used to be. The entire economy of album consumption has been demolished and rebuilt twice since Rick Ross' commercial peak. Nobody buys albums anymore. There is no impulse purchase infrastructure left. There is no display rack. There is no store. What there is instead is an attention economy in which a veteran act with no current radio single is essentially competing against every song ever recorded simultaneously forever. Catalog is the enemy now. And a veteran's own catalog is often the thing eating his new release. Second, and this is the argument his camp has been making all week, and it is not a stupid one, first-week units have almost nothing to do with how a legacy artist at this stage actually makes money. He said it himself, repeatedly, and he was not lying. He gets paid before the album arrives. That is what advances are. That is what publishing is. That is what a touring business built on 20 years of recognizable songs is. Rick Ross is not sitting in a room somewhere waiting on a royalty check to cover his mortgage. The album is a marketing asset for a much larger enterprise, and by that measurement, 3 months of dominating the podcast circuit was arguably a successful campaign regardless of what the chart says. So yes, there is a real defense here. I have just made it as strongly as it can be made. And it still does not save this one. And I want to explain precisely why, because the reason is not the number. The reason is that Rick Ross himself never chose that defense until after the number arrived. That is the whole thing. If a man spends 3 months telling you the units do not matter, the culture matters, the music matters, judge the product not the metrics, and then the units come in soft, and he says, I told you the units do not matter, that man is consistent. You may disagree with him, but you cannot mock him, because his position never moved. But that is not what happened. What happened is that the units were invoked constantly during the campaign, as a weapon. Other people's numbers were fair game. Other people's albums were flops. Other people needed features to compete. The scoreboard was extremely relevant right up until the moment the score came in. That is not an argument. That is a position that changes based on the standings. And audiences, especially this audience, can smell that from a mile away. Which brings me to the second thing I want your opinion on in the comments, and this one is going to start a fight. Who actually comes out of this week looking worse, Rick Ross, for the collapse between the promise and the product? Or the hip-hop internet, for how gleefully it celebrated it? Because I have a strong opinion, and I am going to give it to you before this video ends, but I want yours first. Now let me get into the part almost nobody is covering, because everyone is so busy laughing at the number that they are skipping the actual mechanics of how this happened. And the mechanics are genuinely instructive, because this is not a talent problem. I want to be extremely clear about that. This is a strategy problem, and it is one that half the veterans in this genre are about to walk into. Here is what the set in stone rollout actually was structurally. It was 3 months of conversation, and then a product. That is no longer true, and this album is the cleanest proof of it I have seen all year. Because attention is no longer scarce. Attention is the most abundant resource on Earth. What is scarce now is the specific, particular impulse that makes a human being press play on a full-length album by choice and then listen to the whole thing. And that impulse has almost nothing to do with how many interviews you did. It has to do with whether there is one song that has already lodged itself in the public skull. Rick Ross generated an enormous volume of conversation about Rick Ross. What he did not generate was a single moment of music that traveled on its own, without his voice attached to it in an interview chair. And in the current system, those two things are not related. They are not even in the same building. You can be the most talked about artist in the genre for 90 consecutive days and still open at 1,200 units on day one because talk drives clips and clips drive engagement on somebody else's platform. And none of that touches your streaming numbers. The podcast circuit does not sell albums. It sells podcasts. And by the time the album finally arrived, the audience did not feel anticipation. They felt fatigue. They had already consumed 3 months of the story. The album was not the event. The album was the footnote to an event that had already finished happening in the comment sections. That is how you sell out a press tour and undersell an album at the same time. And that is a genuinely new failure mode. It did not exist 15 years ago. It barely existed 5 years ago. We are watching it get invented in real time, and Rick Ross just became the case study that every label is going to be quietly circulating in meetings for the next 2 years. Now, the second mechanical failure, and this one is more subtle. The declaration of the classic. He said it before anybody heard it. Album of the year. Classic. And I understand the instinct, I really do. Confidence has always been part of the architecture of this genre. You are supposed to believe you are the best. That is the job. Humility has never sold a rap record, and it never will. But there is a difference between confidence and pre-scoring your own exam, and the difference is who holds the pen. When you call your own album a classic, you take the grading pen out of the audience's hand and you write the grade yourself. And audiences have a very specific reflex when you do that. They do not evaluate the work anymore. They evaluate your claim about the work. The conversation stops being, is this good, and becomes, is he right? And is he right is a fight you cannot win, because the only way to win it is a unanimous verdict, and there is no such thing as a unanimous verdict about a rap album 12 albums into a career. Third mechanical failure. The features. The album was loaded with recognizable names. On paper, that is a strength. In practice, in 2026, a feature-heavy album from a veteran reads as an admission. It tells the audience, before they even hear it, that the artist was not certain his own voice could carry the weight. And when the reviews came in describing the project as scattered, as a playlist rather than a body of work, the features became Exhibit A for that exact charge. They were not seen as gifts. They were seen as scaffolding. And notice which name was absent from all of it, because the internet certainly did. The one collaborator whose presence has historically been the single most reliable commercial insurance policy in the genre. Multiple commentators pointed it out within hours. The missing Drake feature, the missing care package, the missing stimulus. And the reason that observation stung so badly is not that the album needed Drake. It is that Rick Ross had spent 3 months insisting that he was above needing anybody, which meant that the absence stopped being a creative choice and became a test result. You do not get to declare independence from the machine and then post machine numbers. The audience will pick one. So step back from the album for a second, because what we just watched was a generational protocol failure. Rick Ross ran the 2011 playbook flawlessly in 2026. And I want to stress the word flawlessly, because by the old rules, this rollout was excellent. Maximum visibility. Maximum controversy. Maximum name recognition. A confident, unapologetic, alpha-posture press campaign. 20 years ago, that campaign would have produced a top 5 debut and a victory lap. The execution was not the problem. The playbook was. That is what people are really arguing about. Not 17,000 units. The expiration date on a formula that an entire generation of artists still believes in. And here is the part that should genuinely concern them, because it is worse than a bad week. The number itself is recoverable. Numbers are always recoverable. One hit song, one placement, one viral moment, and the next album opens 5 times higher. That is not a fantasy that happens constantly. Careers are not ended by a chart position. What is not recoverable, or at least what is much harder to recover, is the invitation. Because for the first time in a very long time, Rick Ross has publicly invited people to argue about his commercial standing. Not his skill. Not his catalog. His standing. And once that invitation goes out, it does not get rescinded. Every future release now arrives with a scoreboard attached to it. Every interview now has a follow-up question waiting. Every confident statement about being the boss now has a comparison sitting underneath it, and somebody in the comments will always post it. That is the real cost of this week. Not the units. The permanent asterisk. And I would be lying to you if I said the culture came out of this looking any better, because it did not. Because let us be honest about what a lot of this week actually was. It was not criticism. It was harvest. There is an entire industry now that does not create anything, does not risk anything, does not release anything, and exists exclusively to convert other people's bad weeks into content. And this week was Christmas for them. They were not analyzing an album. They were farming a man. And that is the machine Rick Ross fed for 3 months, thinking he was using it. He was not using it. He was feeding it. And a machine like that has no loyalty, no memory, and no gratitude. It eats whoever is bleeding that week, and it does not care that you filled its plate all summer. So, who actually won this week? Not Rick Ross, obviously. Not the album, clearly. Not the critics, because nobody remembers a critic. 50 Cent won this week, and I want to give him his due, because what he has built is legitimately impressive and slightly terrifying. He has spent nearly 2 decades constructing a position where he does not have to release anything to defeat anybody. He does not need a single, a verse, or a scoreboard of his own. He just needs somebody else to have a bad Tuesday, and he needs the archive. That is a career strategy with no expiration date, no streaming requirement, and no chart exposure. He has made himself completely immune to the exact measurement that just embarrassed his oldest rival, and he did it by simply refusing to compete in that category ever again. Say what you want about him. That is a genuinely undefeated system. The person who lost, other than the man at the center of it, is the album itself. Because here is the thing that is genuinely a little bit sad about all of this, and I do not think enough people are saying it. Nobody actually listened to it. Not really. Not with intent. Not the way you listen to a record when you are trying to find out if it is good. The verdict was issued before the evidence was examined, because the verdict was more entertaining than the evidence. Somewhere inside that 19-track project, there are probably 3 or 4 songs that are genuinely strong, and there is a real possibility that not one of them will ever get a fair hearing. Because the story about the album became so much louder than the album that the album stopped being audible. That happens more than you think. And it is almost always the actual tragedy in these situations. So let me bring this all the way back to where we started, because I told you at the top that there was a second half to this story that almost nobody is talking about, and this is it. Everybody has been treating this week as an ending. The flop. The collapse. The final chapter of a 20-year run. That is the framing on every thumbnail, including, I will admit, the aggressive ones. I do not think it is an ending at all. I think it is a diagnosis. And there is a very big difference between those two things. What got proven is that the distance between being talked about and being listened to has become enormous, and that a name alone can no longer close it. That is the whole lesson. That is the entire takeaway from 17,000 units. And it is a lesson that applies to every single artist over 35 in this genre right now, most of whom are watching this week very carefully and quietly rewriting their own rollout plans. And here is the honest part, the part one actually believe, and you can tell me in the comments if I am being too generous. Rick Ross is one of the only artists at his level who could actually fix this in one move. Not with a press run. Not with an apology, and God knows not with a numbers explanation. With a song. One song. One undeniable, radio-proof, hook-driven, physically impossible to scroll past song, which he has demonstrably made many times before. That is all it takes. The exact same audience that spent this week laughing would stream it without a second thought, because audiences have no loyalty to their own opinions. They have loyalty to whatever is good right now. The chart does not hold grudges. Only comment sections do. Because if he does, this week becomes a footnote in a comeback story, and every one of these reaction videos becomes free promotion for it. And if he does not, then this week was not the bottom. It was the trend line. So now I want to hear from you, and I mean actually hear from you, because the comments on this one are going to be more interesting than the video. 3 questions. First, is the backlash to this album justified, or has the internet crossed the line from criticism into cruelty? Second, do you think Rick Ross' 3-month promotional campaign helped this album or actively destroyed it? And third, the one I really want an answer to, name one artist from this era who has successfully adapted to the new rules. Because I have a very short list, and I want to see if yours matches mine. Drop it below. I read the comments on every one of these, and the best takes usually end up in the next video, so make it good. And if you made it this far, you already know what to do. Tap that like button, because these are the videos that get suppressed the hardest, and get subscribed if you have not, because there is a whole second half to this story coming. The official Billboard numbers are going to be finalized, the response is going to arrive, and I would bet real money that a certain someone in New York is not finished posting yet. When that happens, we are covering it here first. And here is the thing that is going to make the next chapter genuinely wild, and I will leave you with it. There is a version of this story where Rick Ross does not respond at all. No comeback single, no clapback, no interview clarification. Silence. And if he chooses that, it will be the first time in 20 years that this man has been quiet about anything, and that silence will be louder than the album ever was. I have a whole breakdown on exactly what happens next, and how a specific set of veterans are already quietly solving the problem that just embarrassed him. It is sitting on your screen right now. Go press it. I will see you in that one.